Misha here, and it's time to do part 3, looking back at Japanese aircraft carriers of World War II. In part 1, we looked at the major fleet carriers of the Kilo Butte in Pearl Harbor and a little bit beyond. Part 2, we really kind of went to Midway, talked about their fate, and we looked at some of the early carriers like Hosho and Ryusho. We also talked about Teiho, just to kind of get it in an episode so it could be there. We'll bounce back with her. But this video is going to start off looking at light carriers and conversions of, really these are all kind of conversions of original hulls. Kind of like Junyo, but you know, Junyo was kind of a larger type. So we have basically two members of the same class. Both started off as seaplane tenders and the like. And it's the Zuiho and the Shoho. Shoho actually has an interesting place in history, so we'll eventually start there. And then we have the Chitose here. And we'll talk about her sister ship, Yoda. And yes, it is Yoda, like Yoda. That's fun. And then a vessel that definitely didn't even start off as an aircraft carrier. We have the Mogami aircraft cruiser, which is kind of funny because they toyed around during the treaty era with having aircraft cruisers. That was a different reason. This is because, well, the war. So they all started off as kind of something else. And, you know, that just doesn't feel like quite enough to make a full episode on. So we will also talk about the I-400 series, 401, 402. These are true aircraft carrier submarines. One of the smallest models, at least thinnest, in the line. It's also one of the largest submarines ever created. And yes, it did carry 3 aircraft, and it fits because that was always its intended purpose. I know other submarines had aircraft on board, but they were for scouting. This is for bombing. And they planned on mass producing these. A very different way of trying to master the seas. Still, yeah, the 1/1100 scale from Eaglemoss, pretty cool. And one reason this video is a little bit late, during Prime Day, picked up a new GoPro, been needing to do it. It's not so much that my old one was outdated as it was wearing out. And I don't mean the camera itself, it was working fine, but you know, the fingers, the attachments. I was definitely needing to get a new media kit, because that was the plugs and stuff were just, when you use something every day and outdoors a lot, and you know, after 3-4 years of use, it'll do her. So let me know how this looks. It's kind of on default settings. When my wife gets home, I'll ask her to help, you know, customize it a bit, but at least we got her up and running. I was able to update the firmware. And I thought before I use this on the main Mishaco channel, we'll use this as kind of a test run. So let me know what you think about like field of view, resolution, that kind of thing, and I will take that into consideration. And with that, let's go back and talk about the Zuiho class ships, Zuiho and Shoho. And we'll kind of jump off into history in 1942, where we left off last time, and then we'll revisit Teiho and go on from there. How about that? Shoho and Zuiho, two sister ships, two light carriers of the Zuiho class, which is interesting because neither actually started off life as that class or even with these names. At the end of 1934, this vessel was originally laid down, construction began. It would launch the following year, and it would actually be completed in 1939, but not as Shoho here. It was the submarine tender, the submarine support ship, Shirazaki. So it was in the fleet, but from the beginning, they thought it could be converted. In the summer of 1935, this vessel was laid down, and it would launch a year later, the summer of 36, as the submarine tender Takasaki, but it was also built in such a way that it could be converted into that. It could be an oil tanker, or it could be a light carrier. So basically they just kind of completed a hull, gave it a name, and it kind of just sat around for a bit, although its sister did too. It was decided in 1939 that a light aircraft carrier of the three options what was needed. So in 1940 it was fitted out, finished up, and commissioned, given a new name, Zuiho, meaning auspicious phoenix, and would be in the Japanese fleet soon thereafter. And her sister ship would take a very similar path. Even though she was technically older, she was actually converted into a light aircraft carrier along the same specifications as Zuiho later, hence the Zuiho class versus the Shoho class. In 1941, they decide that, yeah, she's going to be refit, change out her decks and everything to be a light carrier too. And throughout that year, that's kind of what happens. She's officially registered, commissioned at the end of November, so just a week before Pearl Harbor, really. But her fitting out would actually not be complete until January of 1942. So, yeah, a submarine tender first, but an aircraft carrier second. And they were originally built to the exact same specifications, although if you've looked at the models, hopefully, you notice there's a few differences. We'll get there. But for right now, yeah, what is the Zuiho class? What can it bring to the table? It's just over 205 meters long, so 675 feet, give or take. And it has a beam of just under 60 feet, so a little over 18 meters. So pretty commensurate with other light carriers, although its flight deck expands out to 75 feet at its widest point, and it's about 590 feet at this juncture here. She has only one hangar, although she does have two elevators, no catapults, and she was designed to carry up to 30 aircraft, fighters, and bombers. She has two screws, a couple of little rudders. She was originally intended to have a top speed of 29 knots, so not as fast as some of the others, but, faster than Hosho at least. In trials, though, 28 knots was the top speed because of all the refitting and stuff going on. Had a crew. They were kind of crammed in there, about 780 to 790. And air defenses, she had 4 twin 12.7 centimeter guns, so 5 inchers, and 4 twin 25 millimeter guns, 1 inch guns the Japanese Navy really likes. No tower as such. And she could take the most modern aircraft, although early on we kind of get stuck with what remained. And Shoho's first assignment was actually to drop off new aircraft in February of 1942 to support operations in and around the Philippines. And then she'll go back and forth between Truk and Yokosuka, the naval yards, throughout that spring. But then at the end of April, she's actually tapped to be part of Operation Mo, where the fleet carriers Zukoku and Shokoku are the main strike force, and Shoho here will accompany 4 cruisers in the Japanese fleet. And this is an effort to kind of draw out the U.S. Navy, give them another battle, and would result in the Battle of the Coral Sea, and result in Zuiho here, having a somewhat auspicious place in World War II history. Even though her name is Lucky Phoenix, Zuiho here was the first Japanese carrier lost in World War II. Now, note about the name. Yes, I said Zuiho was also Lucky Phoenix. Very similar. Basically, Zuiho means fortunate or straight lucky phoenix. Zuiho kind of translates to good omen type luck. Yeah, it's kind of a thing. This one has more of a like retrospective look back, like lucky in the sense of gestures, whereas Zuiho has more of a forward-thinking type of luck. Anyway, both very similar, which is fine because they're kind of the same ships. Anyway, Operation Mo. They're going to go and, yeah. Her first kind of assignment was to support landings on Tulagi, which were on May 3rd, and she does do that. And her air group consists of 4 of the older A5M Claudes, 8 of the more modern A6M Zeros, and she has 6 B5N Cape bombers. Now, like I said, she was designed to take up to 30 aircraft, and well, she's a little light loaded there with almost half. That's because at this point there's a bit of a shortage, and this is also why she has some of the older Claudes. They're still kind of giving preference on the Zeros to the big carriers. Either way, that's her flight group, and she starts to kind of get close to the U.S. fleet. For example, Yorktown barely misses spotting her on the 5th, but on the 7th of May, we get the Battle of the Coral Sea, when planes from the USS Lexington kind of spot her. The first wave, a little after 11 a.m. from SBD dive bombers, are pretty ineffective. Nothing really happens. So her first luck is okay. At this time, she had a couple of Claudes in the air and a Zero as her cap. After this first wave, she does reinforce it, sending up about 3 more Zeros, so she's got about half a dozen fighters in the air. But the second wave of SBDs, they get through. They at least 2 1,000-pounders hit, doing not insignificant damage. After that, the TBD actually gets a little bit of blood, a little unlike what will happen a month later at Midway, and they get some torpedoes on her. And then there's some other attacks. Basically, she's done for within a few minutes. She gets hit by over a dozen bombs and over half a dozen torpedoes, so she's going under. Of her crew of almost 800, about 300 make it out, but of those, nearly 100 perish or are just lost in the ocean before Japanese vessels can come to assist. While the overall Battle of the Coral Sea is more of a draw, kind of a standstill, and the U.S. takes its licks there too. Yeah, Zuiho here, really on our first big mission, barely half a year into her service, is it down at the ocean, and yeah, just by the percentages, the loss of life are pretty gory. But then again, she took a pounding real fast, real hard. What about her sister ship? Well, the fact that this model is dated 1942 and the other one's dated 1944 gives you at least that clue that she would stay in the fight considerably longer. Zuiho spent, well, the Pearl Harbor period in the early war in Japanese waters, although in February 42 she did go out and do a little bit of supporting of the Philippines campaign. But that was really about it. I'm kind of glossing, you know, these videos are long enough anyway. Her first big assignment, really abroad, was in June when she ended up kind of supporting the retreat from Midway, and her aircraft did help drive off a patrol, a scout from the U.S. that might have followed them and, you know, whatever, so she did there. Much like her sister, there was still this airplane shortage, so she's got about half her fighter complement of A5Ms and half A6M0s, and then some B5Ns too, around the same number of 18-20 planes at this time. But this is going to be when the Japanese have to really rethink their carrier fleet after Midway and what to do. And as I said in the second video, they're not out of the fight. If anything, the fight's just gotten a little more even, because the U.S. has had continual losses too. And so we get into the Guadalcanal campaign and ultimately the Battle of the Solomons. And this is when things really start to turn, but it's a slow, grinding, gradual turn. Zuiho here will operate alongside Shokoku and Zukoku. She will also operate with the carrier Junyo that we looked at in the war in the second half. And eventually she'll be in a kind of a combined fleet with the Chitose and her sister Chioda. But her next big event, after kind of bouncing around, would come in October, the Battle of the Solomons, and this is where her air group will go up against that of USS Enterprise, and it's a bit of a pitched battle at first, but then she does get hit by a couple of 500-pounders, which do damage to the flight deck, putting it out of commission, but the structure of the ships is okay. So she does retreat, and by November, it's heading towards home again for repairs, which begin that December. During the battle there, she would lose about 4 Zeros, and the Enterprise in exchange would lose 3 Wildcats and then 3 TFB Avengers, the new one. So, it really is a pretty well-pitched battle, all things considered. So she'll go in for repairing the damage there. And even though the Japanese Army promised they would get Hendersonville and would repulse the Americans, it didn't happen. So her next assignment in February of 43 is to basically support the withdrawal from Guadalcanal. Her air group has been updated to all Zeros at this point, with some B5Ns on board. And so she will successfully do that. 1943 is an interesting period in Japanese history and World War II history, because it's kind of a bit of a down year. So much so that multiple times her airplanes are detached to operate from land, including after this point, they'll be gone. She'll sail around doing things. Only thing of note here is in April, May, she does get an update with more anti-aircraft guns. I think she gets some triple mounts of the 1-inchers. And from there, her air group will keep getting updated, but these are still young pilots. Should mention that after detaching and floating and supporting and delivering supplies throughout 43, in November, she does have a near miss with the USS Skate submarine. The Allies had broken the Japanese code. They do actually sink a different carrier just a few weeks later, but well, at least Zuiho's kind of living up to her name. She's fortunate. She's able to head back to home waters for another refit and update, and that's actually why this model is a little different. The idea as we get into 1944 is for a combined group with Zuiho, Chitose, and Chioda. And basically between them, they will all have 90 planes and bombers and kind of work together. And to that end, they give her yet more updated anti-aircraft guns. She gets some anti-aircraft rockets. Not sure how effective those are, but okay. And they actually extend her flight deck out a bit so she can, have more room, work with some newer aircraft, because she will soon take on board a handful of B6N, Jills, I believe was that name, but the newer bomber types. This group would actually consist of a lot of Zeros. Between the 3 carriers, you get like 45 Zeros that were also set up to be fighter bombers. You get 18 Zeros that are dedicated fighters. You've still got a handful of B5Ns and even a smaller number of the new B6s. So kind of shows you what they're setting up for. She gets her update and newer flight deck and new pilots, and training begins April, May, and now we're setting up for the Battle of the Philippine Sea. After the lull that was 1943 and warfare on the seas, 1944 will heat up again. But before we get there, let's bounce over to Chitose here and her sister ship, Chiyoda. Eaglemoss never made a model of Chiyoda in the series, so sorry, just what it is. These two did start off as submarine tenders and actually served for a number of years, launching, retrieving, operating with float planes. Chitose here was laid down towards the end of 1934, so around the same time as Zuiho and Shoho, and would launch and be commissioned by 1938 with her sister a short time later. Again, seaplane tender. They would carry roughly 24 various float planes and be used. They'd be around, of course, Pearl Harbor and whatnot. They'd be nearby during Midway, but wouldn't see any action. But, well, Chitose here would be damaged towards the end of 1942 with the Guadalcanal campaign, the Eastern Solomons and all that. And so she'd be put into port to repair her damage. And this is when the decision is taken to refit her from submarine tender float plane manager to light aircraft carrier. From the very beginning, just like with Zuiho and Shoho, they built her in such a way that she could be reworked. And this is still when they were giving lip service to the London Treaty back in 34-35 before they just completely ditched it by 36. So the conversion wasn't all that hard, but it would take the bulk of the year. She would be recommissioned, specified as a light carrier in November of 43, and on January 1st, 1944, she is relaunched, recommissioned into the fleet as a light carrier along with her sister Chiyoda. And since Shoho's long gone, these two plus Zuiho will kind of make up the little light carrier fleet, as I mentioned a minute ago, with a total of 90 aircraft. And really, they are very, very similar overall. Chitose here, along with her sister Chiyoda, are a little over 11,000 tons, light unloaded, but then they bulk up to 15,000 tons once you add aircraft, aviation fuel, all that stuff. I didn't mention it earlier, but Shoho and Zuiho are about the same, about 11,500 tons light, up to about 14,500 tons loaded up. So a little bit lighter than Chitose here, but specifications are the same. She was designed to carry up to 30 aircraft. She has 2 elevators, 1 hangar deck. She has a crew just slightly more at 800. And in the beginning, she has the typical layout of some of the 1-inch and 5-inch guns. But when she's redone as a carrier in 1943, they heap a bunch of 1-inchers on her, like 30 to 40 of them. She still has some 40 millimeters too, but yeah, this is when the Navy starts really just putting the 25 millimeter, the 1-inch guns on them, and yeah, effectiveness be damned. She's a little bit faster, at just a hair under 29 knots, and she's a little bit shorter at 192 meters, so 630 some odd feet long. But she makes up for it by being wider, whereas these were under 60 feet at the beam. She's about 67, 68. And of course, she does have a slightly shorter flight deck, as you can see. So overall, a little different. Also, she just has 1 big rudder versus the 2 on the others. And it's kind of interesting just how they converted these and how they did them. Either way, these would be an important element of the Japanese Navy going forth from the summer of 1944. And a lot of hopes and dreams are kind of riding on them. Zuiho, Chitose, and Choda definitely made out quite a good group of 90 aircraft and would operate together. But the hopes, the dreams, the future of the Japanese Navy lie with Zuiho. As I mentioned in the second video, she was commissioned in March of 1944 and by April became the flagship of essentially this recombined force, meaning that she had a crew of over 2,100 because of the admiral and his staff and everything else. And throughout May, she is off Borneo practicing getting her inexperienced crew, both flight crew and just the crew of the vessel, ready to go. And by June, she's ready for a mission. So the Japanese Navy gathers their carrier strength, getting a total of 9 carriers. Even if, many are light carriers, you still have Shokoku and Jugaku ready to go and whatnot. And you have Zuiho here, the new badass of the fleet. So they're still a force to be reckoned with. Unfortunately, aircraft are getting short supply, so they're really having to collect what they can. And skilled, trained pilots are in short supply. As is rather famously known, the Japanese didn't send home aces to work in schools to train the next generation, like America did, even though that did sometimes annoy aviators, but it did allow them to pass on at least some of their knowledge to the next generation, coming out more skilled than they would have otherwise. Japan just kind of kept their best fighters in the fight until they were gone. And by this point, you're starting to get a little bit of a kamikaze culture going on, although it's not quite at peak yet. Anywho, this was the flagship of the fleet, which took off by June 13, winding up on June 19, Battle of the Philippine Sea. And I can't wait to see what this armored flight deck, armored hangar deck, armored whatever carrier with 60 some odd planes on board, the newest technology can do. Can't you? I'm sure it'll have a glorious fight, even if it ultimately loses. Or not. Yeah, before the fight even got going, there was the USS Albacore, a submarine, around 7:40, 7:45 that morning that spotted her. And, well, she fired 6 torpedoes, essentially a full spread. And probably Zuiho would have been fine. Except she turned to recover some planes, and that put her more in the path. But she did have some planes in the air. Now, luckily for her, 4 torpedoes just straight up missed. Not uncommon. Even in 44, American torpedoes aren't always the best, but still better than they were in 41, 42, I tell you. Of the 2 still heading for the ship, one of them is deflected by a fighter pilot from Zuiho diving into the torpedo successfully. Well, it's a way to go. I'll give it credit. That left just one little torpedo, which this should have had no trouble tanking because it had an internal torpedo defense belt, it had armor, and while it did hit, it hit, forward, just kind of below the front elevator. And it did lead to seawater coming in, and it did rupture some fuel lines. There's a wonderful cocktail of salt water, aviation fuel, oil, all this kind of pooling in that front elevator well, but no fire, no explosion. So the captain, the admiral, just ordered the front elevator to be planked over so operations could continue, and they did. Again, this happened before 8 a.m. They had several successful sorties launched between then and 9:30, and going forward. So all looks well. Now that avgas and all the fumes, they are kind of puddling up, and all that armor and enclosed hangar, yeah, it's not letting them vent out as it would have like on an early carrier like Ryujo, where it just kind of be in the air. They know this, though. They are even breaking out portals or opening up all the hatches trying to vent the fumes. But this is really where the inexperience of the damage repair team comes in. And nevertheless, operations continue pretty much on course until roughly noon. By this time, she hasn't really suffered any additional damage, which is somewhat remarkable in and of itself. And she's had several sorties, several waves, take off, land, refuel, take off again. There you go. But the fumes are adding up. I can't imagine they smell good. And despite their efforts to ventilate, they're still collecting. So the Chief Damage Control Officer orders the ventilation fans on high, which does move the fuel fumes just all over the ship. So what was relatively contained now goes everywhere. And open hatches and broken out portholes aren't enough to let it vent successfully. Nevertheless, operations do continue for over 2 hours, but at 14:30 or so 2:30 in the afternoon, there's an explosion. What started it? Who knows? It's an aircraft carrier. You could say, oh, it's someone smoking a cigarette. I doubt it. But anything can make a spark in this environment. And it did. It sparked. Big. And it wasn't long before they had to declare abandoned ship. The whole thing, the flight deck threw up, the sides bulged out because all that armor, when the explosion came from the inside instead of the outside, contained it and, again, didn't have anywhere for the force to go except into the ship itself. I mean, up into this point, really the only damage they had was they had to slow their top speed by a knot or two just to, compensate for them being a little bit front heavy because of the extra water on board. But nope, it's gone. So the crew does evacuate, at least they try to, and they get a little bit of a grace time. Of course, a lot of people are hurt, injured, killed in this first explosion. There's a second explosion 2 hours later, and that sends her to the bottom of the sea. As I said earlier, she had a heavy crew at this point. Over 2,150 people, including the admiral, staff, all that. Of those, only about 650 were ultimately rescued. Some were killed in the first explosion. Some just weren't able to be taken off in time, and others would perish once exposed to the sea. Zuiho, kind of like the Titanic, is a lesson, but it's really a lesson in training, because the U.S. was able to keep carriers like the Yorktown going long past the time they should have gone under. Concurrently, this took one torpedo hit, something that even light carriers had survived. Like I said earlier, Zuiho took roughly 20 hits from torpedoes and bombs before she went under. I mean, the first couple were probably still fatal, but goes to show you. So, the newest, bestest carrier, the flagship of the fleet, doesn't even last a day. With that said, what about Japan's other two remaining fleet carriers, Shokoku and Zuikoku? Again, they missed Midway for reasons, and they were both put back into service for the campaign Guadalcanal beginning in August. And they would go back and forth. For example, during the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands that October, Shokoku would get damaged quite severely, frankly, and have to go back in for repairs. Zuikoku would again be blessed by the rain gods and kind of avoid detection and whatnot because of that. Kind of funny. Either way, they're the only major fleet carriers available in 1943 because Zuiho's not ready yet. And so they are really kind of used just to be ferries. They have their air groups detached. I should also mention that during the Guadalcanal campaign, the Santa Cruz Islands, they lost collectively about half of their veteran flight group. So a little under 100 aircraft were lost. So they have to get new planes, new crews to fly them on board, what have you. And that's kind of important because we get into 1944 and the Battle of the Philippine Sea. They just don't have very experienced crews. Nevertheless, they're there and they make up part of the 9-carrier fleet. They're the heaviest element, along with Teiho. But again, she's lost, and so is Shokoku. During the battle, she's first hit by 1 torpedo, and then 2 or 3 others follow later. Explosions, fuel, you get the idea. And she loses over half of her crew. Around 550, 600 do make it, but many are lost. And also, Zuiho makes it through the battle okay, but during the retreat on the latter part of the 19th, while they're going out, she's trailed and hit by a bomb, and it does do some damage, but she's able to slip away and put in for repairs. Nevertheless, that day, 2 fleet carriers were lost. More importantly, of the retreating aircraft carriers, they have just over 100 planes between them. So their flight groups were absolutely destroyed. And again, what few veteran pilots might have been there at the beginning were gone. So even the ones that survived probably didn't have a lot of combat experience, and what they did have was probably pretty traumatizing. And that gets us into the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But before we go into October 1944 and that battle, let's talk about the Megami class cruiser. Originally kind of spec'd as a light cruiser. They did grow over time, but they were a bit of a victim of the time they were designed in. They originally came about in 1931, and they were built in the 30s. There were 4 of these, and they were built to adhere to the terms of the London Naval Treaty, which specified under 10,000 tons. So nominally, they were about 8,500, although fully loaded up, they were just under 11,000. And they were the first Japanese guns to have the 6.1-inch gun. It was their main gun in the turrets, but actually they were used as a secondary battery for the battleship Yamato and Masashi. The reason she's in this airplane video is because she's an aircraft cruiser, sort of. We can talk about the Megami classes in a different video. This is long enough. But let's just say she was damaged at the Battle of Midway, June 1942, and she was able to escape, made it home very slowly, and was in dry dock throughout 1943. And during that time, they decided to remove her rear turrets, her rear guns, and give her a relatively modest little flight deck. The cruiser herself is just over 200 meters long, so 600 and some odd feet. And once she got retrofit during the war, she was about 13,000 tons, and she could carry up to 11 aircraft. Now, these were not fighter aircraft, they were reconnaissance aircraft. And it's actually in this this situation, this role, that she was at the Battle of Leyte Gulf as part of the Center Force, which was a grouping of most of Japan's remaining and still functional cruisers, destroyers, and battleships. And they were there to deter U.S. Allied landings. And the 4 remaining functional carriers were actually sent as the Northern Force to try to draw away as much Allied resources as they could, and so repulse things. But they were basically decoys, whereas Megami here was part of the main battleship group and would use her planes for scouting, reconnaissance, and getting firing solutions for the big guns. It's an interesting cruiser, it really is, if not all that perfect. The Northern Force of 4 carriers was the best they could do. Junyo was actually still there, but she'd been severely damaged and was not available. Hosho, still there, was back in friendly waters doing training. And there were a few other small carriers like Zuiho, but we never got her in the Eaglemoss collection. And she would be sunk anyway. So what we basically have is Zuiho, Chitose, Chiyoda, and of course Zuiho is the one remaining fleet carrier and the sole survivor of the original attack on Pearl Harbor. So she's the centerpiece of this diversionary force. And if there was an aircraft shortage earlier, there's a major one now, not to mention pilots. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, that was pretty much crushing it. So actually, Chitose and Chiyoda pretty much had their flight groups disembarked, and they were pretty well empty. They were true decoys. I don't know if maybe a few planes were left on board, but it seems like the bulk of naval aircraft are on the Zuiho and Zuiho here. Of course, it's a light carrier, it's a heavy, but then again, they didn't have a ton of aircraft to begin with. They had about a dozen and a half bombers. Some of the newer, like B6Ns and the D4Ys, they did have some of the more up-to-date Zeros used as fighter bombers and some older fighter-only Zeros. But again, they're just meant to pull Allied forces away, and they're basically sacrificial. They don't expect for them to be coming back. No, the main effort is in the center force, where Mogami is, along with the battleship Musashi and several other cruisers that survive, including her two remaining sister ships. One had been lost back in 1942. So, really, we come to the last gasp of the Japanese Navy in major fleet actions. And for a time, the battle technically began on August 23rd and would go through the 24th with not a lot of engagement, and then the naval battle would really be big on the 25th, at least for the northern force. But for the central force, they were briefly successful. They did draw away forces, and they did kind of delay actions, landings at Leyte and similar. But Mogami, yet again, collided due to poor communications with her sister ship and was damaged by Allied ordnance. And by the 25th, she was scuttled by a torpedo. And that was it for her. And Musashi was also lost during this time, although she did take a pounding. Certainly more than Yamato did. So the battleship group, the cruiser group, is definitely taking a walloping. What about the carrier group, who wasn't supposed to make it back at all? The fleet left friendly waters on the 20th and got in range by the 23rd, and on the 24th, as the U.S. began its operations, the carriers were ordered to send out a wave to try to engage planes from the American carriers like Essex. It's unsuccessful. In fact, the Americans pretty much ignore them for most of that day. They do finally kind of track down and spot the northern force around 1600, 4 p.m. But they've got a lot going on. They're not a big threat right now, and they'll just track them throughout the night, and then they're planning a dawn raid on the 4 carriers. So that's exactly what they do. And again, the two Chitose types are basically empty hulks, leaving any air operations to Zuiho and Zuikaku. Early that morning, Zuiho does have a combat air patrol in the skies. She only has around a dozen Zeros left and a handful of bombers. The American planes are sent. They send 60 of the new F-6F Hellcats. They send 65 of the even newer SB-2C dive bomber and 55 of the slightly older but still very up-to-date TBF or TBM Avengers. So a force over 150 strong of much newer aircraft. At this point, while there are like some B6Ns and D4Ys, you've still got a lot of just A6M0s and even the A6M2s and even B5Ns are around. These are very dated by the end of 1944. Anyway, her cap's in the air. She does try to launch her reserves, but the first wave of attacks from Allied planes come and she gets hit by a 500-pounder, and that pretty much puts her flight deck out of commission, and so she can't do much. But you know, Zuiho is one of the older carriers now and has seen combat, so her damage control team actually does a good job initially, and then she gets a bit of luck because the second wave, about an hour later, kind of ignores her. Instead, she focuses on these two ships. Well, there's one here, but it stands in for two. Chiyoda and Chitose are done for. They get hit by bombs, maybe a torpedo or two. There's some shell fire from surface ships. Eventually sunk, scuttled, gone, kapoots. They were very much just sacrificial lambs. The only good thing they did was, since they did take the second wave, it took stress off Zuiho. But even though she's kind of back up and running, the third wave of attacks later on that morning in the noon hour does hit her, and she's still afloat by 1400 or so. And the fourth wave comes, and they don't really hit her directly, but there's enough near misses, splinters, just stuff flying around that it does additional damage to an already very crippled ship. Therefore, right after 3 p.m., 1500 hours, the order to abandon ship is given, and the light carrier Zuiho slips under the waves a little before 3:30 the afternoon, October 25, Battle of Leyte Gulf. And again, her two near sister ships join her in the same fate. So what about the last of the fleet carriers? Rewinding a bit to the 24th, it was aircraft from the Zuiho that did that really quite ineffective run at the U.S. carriers, just draw them off. In fact, they just lost airplanes, and this is where the bulk of the aircraft are. They had almost 30 Zeros, and they had around a dozen bombers and a couple of reconnaissance aircraft on board. So she's the closest to being fully kitted out. Because she is the last of the fleet carriers, that's why I was really excited to find her in the Eaglemoss collection. But as neat as I like her in 1941 garb, 1942 garb, I think it would have been kind of cool to get her in Leyte Gulf, because by this point she kind of had a green color scheme to kind of blend her in with the sea and nearby islands. And a lot of naval craft at this point get it. Oh well. You know, she has trucked through the war. She was quite lucky for the first couple of years, but then she took her licks and damage, but she's still here and still in pretty good fighting trim, all things considered. Anyway, like I said, she lost some of her aircraft on the 24th. Nothing happened. The first wave that hit Zuiho also hit her quite hard. 3 bombs, 1 torpedo. Fires were started. Damage control was started. And her team is better than Tejo's, at least. She's still staying afloat. Likewise with Zuiho, the second bomber wave avoids her and goes for the 2 tender ships that have been converted, and they get sunk. The third wave hits her good, though. She takes the brunt of the third wave. She's hit 10 more times with 6 torpedoes and 4 bombs. Yeah, she's done for. The only saving grace for her is more than half of her crew do make it off. About 860 some odd do survive, which is a better survival ratio than we've seen. But in the beginning, she was meant to be sacrificial. I guess technically, Zuiho was the last one afloat, but with Zuiho down, the Japanese effectively have no more fleet carriers. Junyo is still around, though, and you got Hosho. What about them? It's obviously not very safe to be above the waves for any Japanese ships by 1944. What about under them? We come to our final aircraft carrier, and it truly was the I-400 series special submarine. And even though we think of this as a late war thing, and it was, it actually goes all the way back to Pearl Harbor. Right about that time, Admiral Yamamoto himself suggested that a fleet of these, should be created to carry at least 2 bombers to attack the American homeland, the American continental USA, not just Hawaii or Alaska, but get close enough and basically just a terror weapon. And to be fair, the Germans had been sending their own U-boats into the Atlantic, into the Gulf of Mexico, all of that. So it's not a crazy thing, and the Japanese are riding high. Well, right around the time of the Battle of Midway, June 1942, this plan is approved, and work is going ahead for the submarine and for the aircraft it would use. They had 1 or 2 designs that they would play around with, but in the end they decided they had to just kind of custom build a dive bomber / torpedo bomber. They went for a single seat at first. That didn't work out, so they ended up with a 2-seater. And they also discovered that they would be able to actually have 3 on board. So the original plan was to have 18 of these, each with 3 bombers, which would become known as the M6A1. There would also be plans for an M6A2, although I think only 1 prototype was ever made. And it would basically just be able to deliver 850 kilograms either in 1 torpedo or equivalent in bombs. And it had 1 machine gun on a flexible mount for defense. Pretty standard. And it could either be a float plane or not, depending. So the plan is for 18. Well, after Midway and after Guadalcanal and all of that, by 1943, of course, Yamamoto will die himself. It's scaled back to 9. But work is going ahead. By 1944, it's scaled back to 5. And very soon after, Philippine Sea and all that, 3 are actually laid down and construction begins. I-400, I-401, and I-403. Excuse me, I-402. Of these 3, only 2 would actually be completed as the special submarine aircraft carrier. The third one would actually go into service, but it would basically be a tanker, a submarine tanker. There you go. Kind of the Japanese equivalent to a milk cow, I suppose. And they would go into service. Now this model from Eaglemoss is really neat. It's in the same 1/1100 scale as our carriers, so it does look a little small. If we set it here, just for a comparison. But let's get a closer look. From the warships of the world, the submarine ships from Atlas, here we have the I-400, or maybe I-401. This is a 1/350 scale, but it is die-cast, and it really kind of goes to show you how large this was. This is a pretty big ship scale, so yeah. It is die-cast metal, though, pretty heavy, and they do have cutouts in the side to show some of the inner workings. I like that, but I wish they had included like a panel you could snap over. But I get it, submarine hulls can be a little boring, especially in this large of a scale, so might as well give it kind of something to have people intrigued with. So now you see how big it is, especially if you look at like a U-boat or something. Basically, it was double the size of any other submarine at the time. Yeah, so they laid down I-400 in January of 1943. 401 would soon go into construction in April, and 402 by September, October of 1943. They're going to have 3 planes each. The flight deck, as it were, is actually a cylindrical tube on top that's watertight. And it's about 102 feet long, a little over 11 feet wide. And the aircraft are stowed in there, folded up, and with their tails folded and everything too. And the pontoons are not attached. The overall ship is about 122 meters, so about 400 feet long. And it comes in at about 6,600 tons. Big. It's capable of about 18.5 knots, but that's surface. Under the water, 6.5 knots top speed. And it has a depth of 100 meters. That's a little problematic when your ship is 122 meters long. On the other hand, it does have radar, and it does have 8 torpedo tubes for close in, and it has the ubiquitous 1-inch guns. It has 3 triple mounts, and then it has 1 single mount on a flexible pedestal. And it also has a 5.5-inch deck gun, because, you know, why not? I knew I was going to do that at least once. It's much bigger. Standard crew was 144 men, including the pilots, so 6, 2 for each plane. And she was designed to be able to go from Japan to the U.S., continental USA, 3 times on one fuel load, or around the entire world or anywhere in the world once. So, good range. There's a lot that could be said, but she was an engineering marvel, of the era. Probably explains why they took so long to be built. They were still under construction throughout 1944. Their airplanes are still being designed, and the first ones were commissioned in 1945. By which time, any idea of hitting the U.S. mainland, doing any damage, was not a thing. So, March of that year, they decide our target's going to be the locks of the Panama Canal. 3 or 4, you say if you see 2, you send 2 of these, you might have anywhere from 3 to 6 bombers make their way through. Of course, they wouldn't have any air cover. And they each have one torpedo or a couple of bombs or 1 big bomb, whatever. That's not going to do anything on the U.S. mainland. But if you can damage or destroy a lock, that could cut off the U.S.'s supplies and slow things down. That's the thought. So they begin training in April, even having mock-ups of the Panama Canal there. And their crews got quite efficient at getting the planes ready to go. They could get all 3 planes out of the flight deck, hangar, and unfolded and ready to go in 15 minutes if you didn't need pontoons. In other words, the idea was either kamikaze or ditch and retrieve the crews at seas. If you wanted the pontoons on board, well, then it's going to take about 30 minutes to get all 3 in the air. They had a catapult with about 100-foot short runway, and they'd use a crane to retrieve them. And all this is, of course, folding. It's all waterproof. So that's the notion. But then, April and May, Okinawa falls. And the war gets terribly desperate. So, in June, the plan for the I-400 and I-401 changes. By the way, 402 would be ready before the war was over, but it was so close to the end that this is why it was never made into an aircraft carrier. It was made into a tanker. So 400 400 and 401 were the functional ones. There were also two other submarines, I-13 and I-14, that could each take 2 of the M6As. And they would end up building 18 full production aircraft. There would be another 11 prototypes / a couple of trainers and 1 experimental M6A2. So that's kind of where that's at. Very customized thing, very unique thing. And America certainly thought so. July 1945, I-400, 401, along with I-13 and I-14, are ordered together in a group, and they are to leave Japanese waters on the 20th and go towards the American fleet at anchor, mostly the carriers, and they will attack them, hopefully at night by surprise. And to further confuse things, they do something that's wholly illegal and just kind of against everything, and they paint their aircraft to look like American aircraft, just to sow confusion. I mean, they'll launch so few that there's not really any worry about friendly fire. And that's the plan, and they do leave. At least 400, 401, and 14 do. I-13 is actually lost in the ocean along the way. So now we're down to 3. And they actually do get quite close to the anchored Allied fleet. Around the 14th, they're getting into position, and the planned day of the attack is August 17th. So they're getting ready to go. They've been training for this. They've got a sole single purpose. And then on the 16th, I-400 and I-401 receive a message. I think it was actually 401 because it was technically the flagship of this small flotilla, ordering them to cease and return home because, well, surrender's happening. And, oh, yeah, by the way, get rid of those planes because we've just lost the war and we don't need more war crimes. So a couple of days later, they push their, well, I-400 pushes their planes over the edge. 401's a little more dramatic. They use their catapult to just toss those suckers into the ocean. And while the U.S. captured a couple of dozen Japanese submarines after the war, most were just scuttled, used as target practice, whatever. But the I-400 and the 401, they were of great interest. They were actually brought over to Pearl Harbor and studied closely for about half a year. But then in 1946, they get worried that the Soviets might get some intelligence on the Cold War starting going, and so they are sunk to make sure that they don't get anything. So obviously the U.S. thought there was some value in these. And to be fair, until nuclear-powered submarines came along over a decade later, these were the largest submarines in the world. And the whole notion was pretty cool. Now, prior to this, submarines had maybe one reconnaissance plane on board occasionally, but this is the first one to actually carry 3 true bomber aircraft. Despite its limitations, just the idea of a submarine aircraft carrier, well, it fits because Japan was arguably the first nation, or second if you prefer, in the world to have a purpose-built carrier. So it does make sense that they had one of the most innovative carriers in 1945. But of course the U.S. was just stomping through the Pacific with all the Essex classes by this point. So that's how this series really never went to war, but came very close and did see active service. By the way, there is one M6A1 aircraft surviving in the world today, for what that's worth. In fact, it might be the M6A2 prototype. I can't recall, but it's one of the test articles that was left behind because the factory they were made at was damaged severely in March of 1945, so production was very much curtailed. So with that, let's talk about the fate of the few remaining carriers today. Junyo, we haven't looked at you in a while. What have you been up to? Well, her and her sister were sent to support operations at Guadalcanal, but halfway into them, Hio had mechanical troubles and had to go back for repairs, leaving Junyo alone. So she would work there through 1943, And throughout that year, she would kind of serve as a taxi for aircraft. Her air group would be disembarked a few times, so on and so forth. Hio would get repaired. Then she would get hit again that summer, have to go on for a little bit of repair. Towards the end of 43, it was Junyo's turn to get hit by a torpedo from a sub, though it was pretty light damage, so she was repaired quite quickly. They're often operating with the light carrier Zuiho at this time. Again, we don't have a model of that, unfortunately, but just another light carrier. And so by 1944, they have a new air group. Of course, there's an airplane shortage, and they're kind of pinned in April, May. They don't have a good way to train their air crews, and submarines are everywhere. They are ordered to divert and help the other forces battle the Philippine Sea, and they do that on the 18th and 19th, but even though they will send out sorties, they don't really engage the U.S. fleet much. They're kind of on the peripheral. They do kind of join up and help the survivors go back home, and it's at this point they do get attacked by U.S. planes that are tailing the main group, and while Junyo would get hit a couple of times and lose an engine, she would make it back, but Hyo would not. She'd get hit, damage control would at first kind of make emergency repairs and be okay, but then fumes built up, and a few hours later she exploded. So they're both damaged there, and after this time, Junyo's air group is not even a dozen fighters and just a handful of bombers, so that July 1944, essentially her air group is disbanded. She's damaged, and it's just, what are you going to do about it? But the Hulk is still there, so they keep using her that year for ferrying planes and supplies around, but the submarine issue is only getting worse. She has a near miss. In fact, her destroyer escort sacrifices herself to a torpedo to keep Junyo going, but then that December, she gets hit by a couple of torpedoes and again is damaged. She's able to escape, limp back to Sasebo for repairs, and they do start to repair her towards the very end of 1944. But after a couple of months, by February, March of 45, they essentially stop repairing her. We don't have any airplanes. She's got a lot of miles on her at this point. She's been damaged multiple times. We've got other things to do. She gets a spiffy new camo paint job, and she's basically turned into a floating battery and barracks ship to kind of be parked at Sasebo Harbor. In June, she's officially kind of reclassed as this. Interestingly, in early August of 45, before the war's even over, they order her stripped of her armament, such as it is, like her so they can move it elsewhere. So she's basically a floating hulk by the surrender of Japan. But she does technically survive. That said, American engineers, specialists did look at her after the war and said, yeah, she was a hunk of junk. Part of it was she started off as a non-carrier. Part of it is, she was the second last old surviving aircraft carrier. I mean, she had been through 3 years of hard war, and repairs were kind of haphazard and slapdash at that. So she was ultimately just sunk in 1946. But again, Junyo did, unlike her sister, survive World War II. Ironically, you know who else actually survived the war and even saw use afterwards?
Well, what you been up to, Hosho? Well, last time we looked at her, she was getting her flight deck extended so she could operate the B-6 and in the D-4Y modern aircraft. But this was still more for training and super reserve emergency purposes only. In fact, because of her increased weight up top and kind of out of balance, she was only authorized to sail in calm, pleasant waters. And so she would bounce back and forth between a few various Japanese ports throughout 1944, spending a lot of time at Kure and a few others, and training a lot of the newer pilots. I mean, it's one of the carriers they have left. But not much happens. Moving forward, March 1945, she's actually hit by a couple of bombs during a raid, and she's repaired. And then in April, when Okinawa was going on, well, first her captain's told, hey, get ready, you might have to go into combat. But then it's thought, hey, what are we thinking? No. In fact, instead of sending her into combat, they actually transfer most of her crew off, making her a fourth-class reserve ship. She's basically just a floating hulk at this point, maybe a guard ship, that kind of thing, through June. But then, at the beginning of July, she's back to being kind of a carrier. In fact, most of her crew that had been transferred off came back on in June into July, and they try to make her ready for something because, well, she's one of the handful of carriers they have left. So what are you going to do? And then she gets hit by another bomb during a raid at Kure, so damaged again. And that pairs her again affected, and she does get repaired by August, just in time for Japan to surrender. So, is that the end? Well, interestingly, no. Much like her namesake, the Phoenix, she rises from the ashes with actually some very important missions. Beginning in October of 45, she is a repatriation ship. She's helping bring Japanese soldiers and civilians home from across Asia, the Pacific, wherever. And this would continue. In December, she would get another refit. This time, they would do what they could to turn her hangar into quarters for refugees to stay in, and they would pretty much get rid of most of her flight deck to make more room for supplies and I don't know. And so she would continue. And she would keep on doing this until about the end of summer 1946. She made 9 trips to and from Japan, taking folks back home, and it's estimated she helped repatriate 40,000 Japanese citizens. I think that's good. I mean, she was obviously in good enough service and seaworthy enough that she was safe enough to transport civilians. So, in a lot better shape than Junyo. And after her final trip, at the end of August 1946, she's handed over to Japan's Department of the Interior, the Ministry of the Interior, for evaluation. And it's decided that she should be scrapped. It's a little bit of a shame. I understand, the nature of things in 1946 post-war, but this carrier had such history behind it, and really, except for some early events in China, it wasn't often a belligerent. It was a training carrier. So if they were ever to be allowed to keep one as kind of a museum piece, this would have been a good one. On the other hand, I don't think in 1946 the Japanese were at all looking back fondly at the war. Oh well. Either way, she was ordered scrap. The work began at the end of that year, and it was completed by May of 1947, meaning that Japan's last carrier and her first carrier were the exact same. I don't know. I find that kind of poetic. And with that, there you have it. We've gone through all the Japanese carriers that Eaglemoss made in their over 80-piece 1100 scale die-cast collection some years ago. And really, with just a few exceptions like Zuiho and Chiyoda, they got them all. Oh, I guess Hio too, but a lot of those look very identical. They got the big historical ships. I'll give them credit there. But what do you think? And also, how do you think the new camera is working out? Like I said, I haven't had a chance to ask anyone to tinker with the settings yet, so I'm sure they'll be needing some adjustment. But let me know. And I hope for those who've been wanting me to do more historical, more military hardware videos, this helped. And the more views and feedback I get, the more it'll give me that kind of push to try to get a lot of these done, because this took several days, and I still had to get these put back up and all that good fun stuff. But for now, hope everyone's having a good one. Catch you very soon next time.